Today I'm going to be building a new DIY pond for my goldfish. Everything from the pond itself, DIY filtration, insulation, cladding and planting, all in this video. But first, the pond it shall be replacing needs to come out. Now this pond has been set up for almost 3 years now and it's been a good pond. I've learnt a lot from it, but it is now time for an upgrade. So the fish have been netted and moved over to my above ground mini pond, which will be their temporary home for the duration of this build. I've also saved as many of the plants as I could so we can reuse as many of them as possible in the new setup. So now that the old pond is gone, we're ready to crack on with the build. And this is what I shall be using for the main pond itself. A 1000 litre or 265 gallon Laguna tub, almost double the volume of my old pond. And unlike the old pond that sat on top of the deck, the new pond is going to be sunk into the deck, and so will be part above ground, part below ground. What I'm doing here is just measuring and working out where I'm going to have to cut the decking. So once that was worked out, I could move the tub back out of the way and start cutting away the deck. Now I did make a bit of a mistake whilst doing this and ended up having to change where I'd initially planned to cut because of where the frame sat underneath the deck, which did mean I was left with a bit of a gap that I would later have to patch up. So once the deck was all up and I'd patched up my little mistake, which I'm hoping I might be able to cover up or at least disguise a little bit more later on in the build, I pulled up the old weed barrier, gave the ground underneath a good rake over whilst trying to get it as level as possible. And once that was done, I was left with a nice clean canvas ready for the build. And the first thing I'm going to do is to put down some building sand. Now this is going to provide a nice base to put the pond on, and it will also allow me to get things more level whilst also providing a little bit of insulation. So once that was done, I moved the pond into position and spent a bit of time getting it as level as possible. Next up, I want to add a layer of bricks around the base of the pond to place my insulation on. So I hit up Wix for the bricks, got them all loaded up, and whilst I was there, I also picked up the insulation, which was way too big to fit in the car, so I cut it up in the car park and off I went. Once back home, I went about adding the bricks all around the base of the pond, trying to keep them as level as possible. And once in position, I added a bit of sand around the edges just to sort of solidify them into place. So with the bricks now securely in position, I grabbed my tape measure and started measuring for the insulation that will be going around the pond. I then cut the insulation to the required size and added it to the outside of the pond. Now these little bits at the top here did take a while, but I do really want this pond to be as insulated as possible, so I made sure I got it all done. So next up, it was time to clad the outside of the pond, which should hopefully make it look a little bit nicer. And for that, I'm using decking boards. So after another quick wick strip, I was back home again, and I'm starting out by cutting the boards to a length that will allow me to create a frame. Which once screwed together, should just slide over the top of the pond. I then just need to make 3 more, slide them all into position, and the pond is pretty much clad. Now at the top, as you can see here, I did add 3 notches which are cut out using a jigsaw, and these will allow for any pond hosing, air lines or things like that to be brought into the pond later on. So once that was done, I used some spacers to get it to the exact height I needed. I then screwed on some vertical pieces of decking to hold everything into position. And once that was done, I could remove all the spacers. And then, again using some more decking, added a trim around the top just to finish it all off, whilst at the same time making sure everything was nice and level and then securely screwed down. So now that the actual pond is in, we can move on to the filtration. Now I'm going to have two filters on this pond, one that will primarily focus on mechanical filtration, which is the physical removal of debris and waste from the water, and one that will focus on the biological side of things, which is the breaking down of ammonia, nitrite, and hopefully also nitrate. Starting though with the filter that will deal with the mechanical side of things, I'm going to be making this filter out of this 240 litre wheelie bin, or if you're in the US, 63 gallon trash can. And this filter is going to work by the water being pumped to the bottom, where it will then rise up through our chosen media and overflow back out into the pond. And I'm starting this filter build with the inlet, which I'll be using a 1-inch tank connector for, that I'm going to take in through the top of the filter. And I'm going to go in through the top rather than the bottom because firstly, it's a flatter surface, so I'm thinking that means a better connection and less chance of a leak. And secondly, because the filter is going to be half buried next to the pond, if in the future I ever need to get to this inlet, it'll be a lot easier to reach if it's at the top. So now that the inlet is in, we do need to create a way for the water to be directed to the bottom of the filter. And to do that, I'm going to be using a length of pond hosing cut to the height of the filter. And I'm now going to add an elbow at one end and a T at the other. And now that's all sorted, I'm going to connect the elbow end to the tank connector on the inside of the filter. And now when the water comes into the filter, it will be directed straight to the bottom and dispersed out through the T. So with the inlet sorted, we can now move on to the outlet, and for that I'm going to be using a 3-inch tank connector. Okay, so outlet done. We now have a way for the water to exit the filter after it's risen up through the filter media, which we will be adding shortly. First though, we do need to create a void space in the bottom of the filter, and we'll be doing this by using a plastic filter grid cut to size. And to lift it up off the bottom, I'm going to be using 4 drain pipe brackets, and I'm using these just because they happen to be around about the right height when needed and are easily zip tied to the filter grid. So once that was done, I cut out a little noggin in the filter grid. Which just allows the hosing that goes down to the bottom of the filter to fit through. So now the water comes in at the bottom of the filter within the little void space. This allows the water to more equally disperse before rising up through our media, which, because the filter will be focusing on mechanical filtration, will be mainly sponge. And I've got various porosities of sponge that I'll be using, including coarse, medium and fine. Once they're cut to size, I can add these to the filter, starting with the coarse at the bottom and working my way up to fine at the top. Now, if I find that these sponges clog up too fast, I can always swap out the medium and fine sponges with some more coarse, or maybe some sort of Metalamat that won't clog up as quick. But as with any DIY project, sometimes you do need to tweak a few things once it's been up and running for a while. Obviously, the rate that these sponges will clog up though and need to be cleaned will be completely dependent on the stocking level of the pond. That being said, now that all the sponges are in, I'm going to just top them off with another plastic grid and a good sized bag of Alpha Grog biomedia, which should just hold everything nicely in place whilst also adding a little bit of extra biological filtration into the mix. So that is the first filter that will take care of the mechanical filtration almost done. There is, however, a couple more things I do need to add to the hosing that will connect the pond pump to the inlet. Firstly, a non-return valve, which will stop the water from siphoning out of the filter and back into the pond if there was to be a power outage. And a flow control, which will allow me to control the flow. Now that our filter that will take care of the mechanical side of things is complete, it's time to prep the area where it will be located next to the pond. And because of the height I want the outlet of the filter to be at, I'm actually having to dig down slightly lower than the base of the pond itself. So once at the required depth, I levelled the area the best I could, added some building sand, and finally some slabs to finish off. So that's our base done. Before we can move the filter into position though, I want to add some strengthening timber around the filter itself. This is going to stop any potential bowing, and I just think it will really ensure that the filter lasts for many years to come. So once the strengthening timber had been added, I could go ahead and move the filter into position. and then filled it up with water, because once full it may just move down very slightly, and I wanted to make sure it was in its final location before continuing with the build. So once filled, it was time to add the insulation, and I basically just went ahead and stuffed it in wherever I possibly could. You can't really have too much insulation in my opinion, and I'm pretty sure the fish will appreciate it come the winter months. So with the insulation in, it's time to add a layer of bricks around the base of the filter, similar to how we did with the pond, and this will be for our cladding to sit on. I also added gravel around the bricks to really lock everything into position. Once all that was done, it was definitely not going anywhere. It doesn't look great though, so we do need to get it clad. And I'll be doing that in a similar way to that I did with the pond itself, using decking. It was however a little more tricky, with a couple more steps taken, including adding gravel in and around the bottom layer to bring it all up to ground height, cutting out various notches for pipe work, and adding a hole for the filter outlet. Once all done though, I made a quick cover for the top, again out of decking. And it was starting to look pretty good. So now that we're sorted on the mechanical filtration front, we can move on to the biological side of things. And for that, I'm going to be building a bog filter. So instead of using sponge as the filter media, I'm going to be using various sizes of rock and gravel that, as well as providing surface area for the beneficial bacteria, will also be the growing media for various plants. And I'll be making it out of this 330 litre or 90 gallon plastic tub. And in the same way as the first filter, I'm going to be using a 1-inch tank connector as the inlet that will go in through the top of the filter. And then, using a couple of lengths of pond hosing, a couple of elbows and a tee, the water will be directed to the bottom where it will be evenly dispersed, ready to travel up through the filter and back out into the pond. So now that the inlet is sorted, I'm going to move on to the outlet, which again, like the first filter we built, I'm going to be using a 3-inch tank connector. So now that the 3-inch tank connector has been installed, I'm going to be adding some 3-inch PVC pipe. And so this is where things start to differ from the previous filter build, and I'm going to cut this 3-inch pipe to the width of the bog filter. I'm then going to attach an end cap to one end, and now I'm just going to drill a load of holes in it, sticking mainly to one side. I just need these holes to be big enough to allow good water flow, but not so big that any gravel could get into the holes and block it up. And by adding this to the outlet, it will not only allow us to slightly adjust the water level within the filter with a simple twist of the pipe, it will also prevent any gravel from getting into the outlet and being washed into the pond. So now that's done, we can move on to creating the void space in the bottom of the filter. And for that, I'm going to be using a couple of filter grids cut to size and zip tied together to fit the base of the filter. Now I'm also at this point going to be adding a small hole in the grid, and the reason for that will be explained shortly. But next, instead of using drain pipe brackets like I did in the first filter to create the actual space underneath the grid, I'm going to be using some of these vent terminals that I found in the plumbing area of Wicks. These are a lot stronger than the drain pipe brackets, and so should hopefully be able to hold the weight of all the rock and gravel. So now that's in, we can circle back to why I added the hole in the plastic grid. And the reason for that is so I could add a vertical piece of PVC pipe, which I have gone ahead and cut to the height of the filter. And I've also just cut out a couple of notches. And this is just going to slot over the hole that we previously cut out. Now these notches just provide a way of temporarily holding it in place whilst we're waiting to add the rock and gravel, because once that goes in, that's what's going to hold it in position and stop it from moving anywhere. But what is the purpose of this piece of PVC pipe, you may well ask? Well, its purpose is to provide a way of reaching the waste that will settle at the bottom of the filter. Basically, from time to time, I use my pond vac, put it down the PVC pipe and suck out the waste, and thus providing an easy way to maintain and clean out this bog filter. So now that's all done, all I need to do again is to add a non-return valve and a flow control to the pond hosing that will connect to the inlet. And now, before we add the rock and gravel, we need to get this into position. Before we can do that though, we do need to prepare the area where it shall be sitting, and I'll be doing this in a very similar way to how I prepared the base for the first filter, although instead of digging down for this filter, this time I need to raise it up a little bit, and again this is just because of the height I want the outlet pipe to sit at. So what I'm adding here is some type 1 sub base, which once packed down should create a nice solid base to our building sand. And then our slabs. I also added a piece of foam underlay that I happened to find in the garage just as a cheeky bit of insulation. Once that was done though, it was ready to accept the bog filter, but before I bring it over, in the same way as I did with the first filter, I want to add a strengthening timber frame around it to stop any bowing. So now that's done, we can move the filter into position and add in the insulation. Insulation done, it's cladding time. Cladding done, and we are looking good, and because all the cladding is now done, I'm going to get it all stained up. And the stain I've decided to use is this P2 Super Seal stuff, and the reason I've gone with this is because it's completely non-toxic, to the point where I've heard you could literally get a blob of this stuff in your pond and it won't harm your fish. I mean, I wouldn't recommend pouring it in your pond, but good to know if you accidentally get a bit in there, it's not going to be a problem. Okay, so the stain is on and we are now protected from the elements. I also added a couple of extra lengths of decking around the pond and filters just because I thought it would finish things off a little bit more nicely. And I also added some river pebbles around the mechanical filter, again, just to finish things off. And things are looking good. We're not stopping here though. Next on the agenda is to get the bog filter filled with the rock and gravel. Now, as I'm adding this first layer of the largest rock, you may have noticed this and thought that wasn't in there before, and you would be correct. And that is just a large piece of slate that I've just added, and it's just to hold the hosing down at the bottom, because earlier when I added some water to do a little test run, I noticed it was a little bit floaty. So I did that just to hold it in place. Probably be okay without it, but just thought I'd mention it. Anyway, let's get the rest of the rock and gravel in. Okay, so our rock and gravel is in, largest rocks at the bottom, working our way up to the smallest 10mm pea gravel at the top. Though I did put the slightly larger 20mm around the outlet pipe, just because I was a little worried the smaller gravel might get stuck in the holes. So with that done, the next thing I'm going to do is to add some PVC pipe to the outlets of both the filters, just to extend them out a little, because if I don't do that, I don't think the returning water would actually reach the pond. And I've just glued them in using some solvent cement glue. And with that done, I think it's time to finally start on the interior of the pond by adding in and hooking up the pump, which will feed both the filters. And the pump I'm actually using is the AquaMax Eco Classic 5500. And as you can see, I'm raising it up off the bottom of the pond, and this is just as a safety precaution that will prevent the pond from being completely drained if there was ever to be a leak with either of the filters. And the little cube I'm using here to do this was made out of PVC pipe. With a little piece of filter grid zip tied onto the top. And yeah, that's just going to keep the pump up off the bottom. So with the pump in position and the cable tucked up out the way, Just before we add the water, I want to add a fish cave, which will also double up as a marginal planting shelf. And again, using PVC pipe and some 3-way elbows, I'm making another cube, a bit bigger this time. And once I've drilled a few holes in it to make sure that it sinks, I'm going to put it in this front left-hand corner of the pond, and then place this large piece of slate rock on top of it to create a lovely little fish cave stroke marginal planting shelf. And it is now finally time to add the water. Whilst the pond fills, I just want to mention that I have decided not to put any substrate, i.e. gravel, on the bottom of the pond. And this is just for maintenance purposes really, because by not having gravel on the bottom means from time to time I can get my pond back in there and have a good clean out. But let me know in the comments, should I add gravel or some sort of substrate into the bottom of the pond, or should I keep it bare for easy maintenance? Anyway, now the pond is filled, let's get that pump running. And there we go, the pump's going, powering both the filters, and I'd say that flow rate is pretty much perfect. And with not one single leak, which I'm not going to lie, I was pretty surprised about, it's time to get planting. And I'm starting out with a selection of plants for the marginal planting shelf. And what I've got here is marsh marigold, peppergrass, parrot's feather, and a little cutting of watercress. And after placing a planter basket filled with pea gravel on the marginal shelf, I rinsed all the soil off the plant roots and then planted them in the pea gravel. And by doing this, the plants will be forced to pull all their nutrients from the water column, therefore helping keep the water cleaner, clearer, healthier, and hopefully algae free. And now that our marginal shelf is done, I've grabbed another plastic planter that again I've filled with pea gravel, and in this one I'm going to be adding my oxygenating pondweed. And I'm going to put this right down at the bottom of the pond in this far left hand corner here. That should grow in nicely and provide the fish with not only a nice bit of cover but also a healthy snack. And with the pondweed in, I've got one last plant to go inside the pond, and that is our water lily. And this is the one from the old pond, but what I'm going to do is to repot it into a bigger pot. And because water lilies are such heavy root feeding plants, I am going to be using aquatic compost for this one and some fertilizer tabs to really try and boost that growth. But as you can see, I am capping that off with some fine gravel, then some pea gravel to lock that nutrients down. And once the water lily was planted, finally, on the very top, I added some 20mm pea gravel that should hopefully stop the goldfish from digging it up. Now that's done, let's get it in. Okay, so that's the water lily in and looking good. So next up, I'm going to be adding a couple of air stones. And the air pump I'm using to power these air stones is the Bermuda Breeze 10 air pump. And it has 2 outlets on it, hence the reason I'm adding 2 air stones. I'm adding 1 air stone to the pond itself, and 1 into the Wheelie bin trash can filter. And I'm putting it under our biomedia, which should help promote some healthy beneficial bacteria growth, and I think it should also help to reoxygenate the water before it returns to the pond. But yeah, the air stones will not only ensure there is adequate oxygen within the pond, but because of where I've placed the air stone within the pond, it should also help push any fish waste or debris over to the pump to be sent off to the filters. And with our air stones in, we can now move on to planting up our bog filter, and I've picked up a few new plants. And I've also got a few left over from the old pond. And again, the plant roots have been all rinsed off of any aquatic soil. And I'm starting out with some Dutch Rush. This is native to the UK, it's evergreen, and it's one of my personal favourite bog filter plants, as it's always grown well for me within the bog filter setting without becoming too invasive. Next up, I've got a couple of Typha plants. Now, Typha is great for water purification, however, it will get big, it will spread, and it has got a big root structure. So it will need to be maintained or it can become a bit of a problem. But I think it's worth it for how well it keeps the water clean. The next couple of plants I've got are water iris, and water iris is quite similar to Typha in that it's great at keeping the water clean by pulling out excess nutrients, but also has the added bonus of having a nice flower. These ones aren't currently in flower, and because we are now quite late into the season, we probably won't see any this year now, but next year we should see some nice yellow flowers from this plant. Next up, I've got some pickerel weed. Now, I've never actually kept this plant before, but I'm just going to put it in and hope for the best. Hopefully it does well though, because it does produce a nice purple flower, which is apparently very good for the bees. So that's our big plants in. Next up, I've got a couple of varieties of marsh marigold, and I've got the standard yellow version and the white version. And the good thing about the marsh marigold is that they flower early spring, so you get a nice pop of colour early on in the season. And finally, I've got a little bit of peppergrass left over from the marginal planting shelf And I'm just going to pop it in at the front here. Don't really know how well this will do, but it is native, so hopefully it does all right. So that's our bog filter fully planted up, and everything is now looking really quite lovely. So all we've got left to do now is to add some lighting, do a bit of landscaping around the pond, add an easy to remove lightweight herring net, and obviously we need to add the fish. That will all be in the next video though, so hit the subscribe button and I'll see you then.